Okay, I think we can start. Welcome from my side. My name is Cornelius Senf. I'm part of the International Tree Mortality Network. We are a network of scientists working on the topic of tree mortality. If you are interested more in the network, here's the link. You can have a look at our homepage and all the stuff we do. One of the things we do is this seminar series. It's the 18th seminar we have since 2020, I think. And it's the first one after a long summer break. And I'm really glad we have Tommaso Jucker with us today. Tommaso is a forest ecologist from the University of Bristol, working on the intersection of field-based forest ecology and remote sensing-based forest ecology. And I'm really curious to hear what he'll tell us about forests and lasers, which he admitted to me is his true love. So Tommaso, the floor is yours, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Cornelius. While I share my screen, I'll just take the opportunity to thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you all for coming today. Can I just ask for confirmation that you can see my screen? Yes, I think you should be able to see it now.
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect.
And it's now also full screen.
Fantastic. I'm going to minimize you, so I won't be seeing you, but I'll hopefully see you in a little bit. So yes, again, thank you very much for joining me. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak. This has been really one of my favorite online seminar series of sort of pandemic and post-pandemic. So it's really an honor to be here. I think particularly because I don't actually think of myself as someone who works on tree mortality. So I had to sort of bend myself backwards to figure out how I would sort of fit the theme. But anyway, you'll have to tell me at the end how we did. So yeah, so the theme of the talk today is basically what we can learn from using airborne LiDAR to understand the dynamics of forest ecosystems. And I really wanted to stress this idea of looking across different types of scales. So spatial scales, temporal scales, but also ecological scales. And just to start, I wanted to give you a little bit of context on what we actually do in the research group and sort of how the rest of what I talk about will fit into this. Our goal really overall is to try to understand how forest ecosystems are responding to global change and really to understand how these global change factors are influencing the structure and function of these ecosystems. So we're interested from anything from sort of carbon dynamics to the implications that these processes have for generating 3D structure, to how this regulates microclimate, and how this ultimately shapes the biodiversity and the habitat of the species that live in these ecosystems. And I'd argue really that to do this sort of kind of research justice, we can't really ignore what's sort of capsulized beautifully in this diagram from this review paper from Nate McDowell, which is really trying to argue that we need to have a clear framework for understanding how sort of the dynamics of forest ecosystems are responding to multiple different pressures of global change. So these might be drought, it might be land use change, it might be wildfires, insect outbreaks, and all of their interactions. And really, if we want to understand the structure and function of ecosystems going forward, we need to have some kind of predictive framework that fits into this kind of scheme. And really, what I want to focus my talk on today is these two middle sections of this box, really understanding sort of how ecosystems are impacted initially by disturbance, but also their recovery trajectory afterwards. And hopefully convince you that LiDAR can really help us drill down to some of the processes that are happening in this space. Okay, so how do we actually go about tackling these kind of questions, the ones that were in this scheme? Well, traditionally, ecologists have relied on forest plot networks to do this kind of work, and they have some obvious advantages. We're monitoring trees at their actual level. We've got tree level information. We know something about the species information, about their traits. And if we're interested in mortality, we might be able to also gauge some information about how and why trees died in a particular forest. So we have various examples globally of places where people have sort of compiled sort of big networks of forest plots to try to build these temporal pictures and temporal and spatial pictures of how these ecosystems are responding. So this is just one example from the forest plot network using data from both Africa and the Amazon. And you can see that really through this combinations of hundreds of different plots monitored over year to year and over multiple decades, we start to begin to get this picture of how the carbon fluxes of these ecosystems are changing over time. But obviously, one of the counterpoints to these forest plot networks is that while those numbers are incredibly impressive in terms of the number of plots that are here, and they require an absolutely huge amount of work to collect that data, spatially, they're only representing a tiny, small fraction of the forest ecosystem as a whole. So I would argue that the right opposite end of the spectrum to sort of fix this sort of kind of issue of representativeness is satellites. So satellites give us this broad spatial temporal coverage of forests, and they're really excellent when it comes to doing things like detecting forest loss. So here is just a little quick animation of some planet data looking at an area in Brazil, and it's obvious why the power of these data, but just looking at that as an animation, you can really see how this landscape is changing over time, and we can map it through in really high detail. And we've got some great examples, including some really nice work by Cornelius himself, which I like to show anytime I'm talking about this kind of work, about the power of this kind of data. So this is basically tracking changes in canopy mortality across Europe, and basically allowing us to understand how these trends are changing over time, and really getting to grips with the fact that these trends all seem to be pointing upwards. So rates of canopy mortality seem to be going up, almost doubling across Europe over the past sort of 20 to 30 years. So again, we have this wonderful spatial picture that we get from the data, but at the same time, there's also some limitations with these data themselves. We touched a second ago on the limitations of the forest plot data, but from a satellite perspective, from my perspective, one of the big ones is that we're only really able to study these stand replacing disturbances. So things that wipe out all of the trees in a stand and are large. But actually, quite a lot of disturbances that happen in these ecosystems only remove one or few trees, and the canopy remains intact. So most of that is getting missed by these sort of satellite kind of approaches. And I think the other argument that I would put is that our ability to track the recovery of forests from the satellite data is also much poorer than it is our ability to sort of detect loss. And so the case that I want to put to you today is actually that airborne LiDAR sort of fits beautifully in the middle of this intersection of these two opposite polar ends of our approaches, and it can be a really useful tool to sort of bridge the gap between some of the strengths and weaknesses of them. So just for those of you who are not familiar with what LiDAR is a laser-based technology which involves having a sensor which emits hundreds of thousands of laser pulses per second, and this sensor can be placed on any object. It can be on the ground, it can be on an airplane, on a drone, and even on a satellite. And basically by flying over this landscape, as in this case, and emitting all of these hundreds of thousands of pulses and recording the time it takes for them to return to the receiver, we can actually build a three-dimensional picture of that ecosystem. So this remote sensing technology for me is intuitively appealing because you can see, just as you can see here, the actual individual elements that make up that forest, that kind of intuitive understanding that we have about trees when we go to the field. And just to give you a sense, it can do this at really big spatial scale. So this is some example of some data acquired in Malaysian Borneo in 2013. And this is a canopy height model. So we're viewing the forest from the top now. And the sort of yellow colors correspond to these tall emergent trees, which in this case might be even more than 80 meters tall. And so we can build this really detailed three-dimensional map of the forest structure across the entire landscape. But obviously we could do one better. If we go back to the same place, in this case, and we go back 7 years later, we can actually start to build a picture of the dynamics of the system. We can start to spot subtle changes in the canopy that tell us something about the processes that are going on underneath. And so just to give you an example, this area that's shown on the screen here is roughly 4 kilometers squared. If you were to try to go to the field and map all the trees and gaps in this forest, it would probably take you your entire lifetime. But within these two surveys, we immediately have a snapshot of all the new gaps that have created over the 7-year period at this large scale, which really is starting to give us quite a nice understanding of the dynamics of the system. And so to me, this is the really attractive feature of this kind of data, this ability to both map spatially, but also then sort of compounded through time as well. And so I just wanted to basically proceed by two examples. So I've picked two pieces of work that we're currently doing in the group that I think fit nicely within this theme. They're nice because they tackle very different ecosystems. One is about the tropics. One is about a dry woodland ecosystem in Australia. One is going to be focusing primarily on logging as a disturbance and the recovery from it and a canopy scale. And the other one instead is going to be thinking about sort of post-fire dynamics and really drilling in at the individual tree scale. So hopefully there's a flavor for all of you that are on here. So sorry for the first piece of work. We're gonna fly over to Malaysian Borneo. This is actually a photo from that I did not take, but it's a photo from a dipterocarp forest in Malaysian Borneo. So this gives you a real sense of or what this system looks like. And we're going to be thinking a little bit about how these systems recover from logging. And the work that I'm presenting here is really a lot of it has been done by Lucy and Toby, who are sort of in the group. So they deserve all the credit for what I'm going to show you. So why Borneo? Well, Borneo is a good example from a tropical perspective of somewhere where in the last 40 to 50 years, we have seen a very strong change in forest ecosystems. We've seen two processes happening. One is widespread forest loss and conversion to oil palm. So since the 1970s, we've sort of lost about 25% of sort of intact forest cover. But beyond that, what this figure right on the right shows you is that what's left of these forests, a lot of it is actually logged forest that is in some way degraded. And so that's what we're really focusing on today, these light green patches here. And to give you a sense of what they actually look like on the ground, or if you were flying over them with a plane, this is again a canopy height model from LiDAR. And this is a typical scene that you might see in this kind of landscape. You will see basically fields of oil palm, which are this sort of dark blue areas on this map. There will be areas that are riparian buffer strips where in sort of forests have been left along river edges. There'll be pieces of the landscape which have been selectively logged, and so there's some remnant trees, but there are big gaps left over from the logging. And then there'll also be some fragmented sort of patches of old growth forest within that. And really the question that I want to get at today is trying to think of, okay, this is what's there today. How could we go about, if we were interested in restoring some of these ecosystems, do so in a way that's as effective as possible? And I'm thinking from a perspective of both carbon that's stored in the system, but also the biodiversity potential of them. And to do that, we are going to leverage really what in my mind is a unique sort of study site in Sabah in Malaysian Borneo, and this is the Sabah Biodiversity Experiment. So the Sabah Biodiversity Experiment was set up by Andy Hector in the sort of early 2000s, and it's this large-scale landscape-scale experiment where we basically have a patch of forest which was selectively logged until the 1980s. It's about 500 hectares in size, so it's really quite large. And within this sort of patch of forest, we have Andy and his team have set up this sort of factorial and replicated and randomized experiment where we have 124 plots. Each of these plots are 4 hectares in size, so they're really big plots. And then within these, we have a series of different treatments that have been applied, which sort of relate back to sort of the some of the more common approaches to restoration in these kind of systems. So we have in the gray boxes, these are the unplanted controls. So these serve as our baseline to understand how the system is changing if we do nothing. We have 3 treatments which involve some combination of planting trees. This is what we call enrichment planting, planted down lines. And so we have treatments where only single species of tree was planted. We have ones where a mixture of species was planted, either 4 or 16. And in total, about 100,000 trees were planted across all of these plots. And then we have a sort of a 5th and final treatment, which is this, again, the tree planting, but at the same time, liana cutting. So removal of these sort of what people call, and I really don't like this term, but structural parasites of the canopy, and removing them with the idea that they might allow trees to regenerate more rapidly. And sort of on top of all of this, we're very fortunate to have 2 LiDAR acquisitions, one that was conducted in 2013 and one was conducted in 2020, sort of 20 years roughly after the start of the experiment. So just to give you a sense of how this system differs from a nearby old growth system, which is intact. This is from the 2013 data on the left. And what you can see is that there's big differences in the canopy height of these two systems. The restored forests are on average about 15 meters shorter than the old growth forests. And they're missing a lot of the really tall emergent trees. And they're also different in terms of their dynamics. So on the right, what I'm showing you here is if we do the difference between the 2020 and the 2013 data and look at the height change within the two acquisitions, we can see that basically the restored forests are gaining height at a faster rate per year than the old growth forests, which is sort of what we'd expect in this system as they're recovering from a disturbance. But what I really want to unpack here of all of this is this box here in particular. What I want to get at is how much of the variation in this box, which is quite large in terms of sort of like recovery trajectory, can be explained by these different interventions that were done at the Savo Biodiversity Experiment. So starting just with the tree planting, and I'm not really going to get into the different species mixtures, but I'll treat all of the planting as one unit. The first kind of thing that we see when we look at this is that on average, the unplanted controls where nothing was done have gained about 13 centimeters per year in canopy height. This is just looking at the whole of the canopy. So there might be areas of the canopy that have shrunk because of gaps that have formed, but it's basically looking at all of it at once. And it's sort of going up by about 13 centimeters per year. And we get a tiny increase in terms of growth when we look at the tree planted plots, but it's actually statistically non-significant, and it's really not very big in terms of magnitude. So that's the sort of first take-home message from this. What I sort of intuitively thought would be the case, but I'm still struck by the strength of it, is what a big difference it makes when we add the liana cutting on top of that. So when we add the liana cutting, actually the rate of recovery of this canopy almost basically triples. So we're going from about 13 centimeters per year to around 40 centimeters per year. And now these differences are very statistically significant. And so we're really starting to see this big difference when we start to remove these climbers within the system. And we can actually dig a lot deeper into this data to get a better sense of exactly what's going on. I told you that those were just sort of average changes in the canopy, which might well include areas that have new gaps or tree falls or whatever it might be. So it's a noisy sort of first summary. But we can actually split up the canopy into sort of three different compartments. One of them is the gaps that already exist in the system. So this is the 2013 data, and we can map all the gaps in this based on a height threshold. So these are anything that reaches 10 meters to the forest floor and has a minimum size. So we know where all the gaps are. We can then do the change over time, and we can start to map where new gaps have emerged in this system. So in this case, anything in red is a depression, so where the canopy has decreased by a certain amount, and the really dark red bits, these are the new gaps that have formed between the two acquisitions. So we've got a sense of where the new gaps are. So this is our disturbance. And finally, we can separate that from the background. So the rest of the canopy, which has sort of remained more or less intact between those two transition periods. And so what I want to do is I want to separate out these three different layers and look how they've changed over time in response to these different interventions. So starting with firstly, the formation of new gaps, the new disturbances, and thinking again about what's happening with the lianas. If you look at the top bar up here, this is the mixing, the sort of the planting with the liana cutting. And what you can see is that the rate of new gap formation is much, much smaller when we have the liana cutting. It's about a third actually of what we see in the controls. And it's also considerably lower than what we see when we look at the different tree planting. So liana cutting seems to have an effect actually on the disturbance rates, on the formation of new gaps when we remove these lianas in these logged forests. So that's one thing. The second thing is we can look at the actual height change within each of these three different forest patches. And again, what I want you to take home from this is the blue, both dark blue and light blue are either the stable canopy, so the whole of the canopy that's remaining, or the gaps that were present in 2013. So we're really focusing on the regrowth within these two patches. And what you can see is that the liana cutting seems to be firstly accelerating quite substantially the rate of regrowth within the gaps. So within the gaps, the canopy height is increasing by about 1 meter per year, compared to about 70 centimeters per year in the controls, and much, much less actually in the old growth forest. But it also seems to be affecting the remnant trees. So everything that remained intact previous to, which regardless of disturbance. So this is these light blue bars. And again, these are suggesting that the plots that were treated with the liana cutting have actually, the rest of the canopy is growing back much faster. I mean, it's not a huge effect, but because this stable canopy portion corresponds to the majority of the plot, when we add it all up, it makes a big difference. And this is really what this last figure is showing here. So when we combine the area-based approach, which is the first plot on the left, with the height approach, we can actually calculate a change in volume that's occurring within each of these different treatments. And here is where the effects of the liana cutting really come out. So again, the top bar is the liana cutting, and you can see that when we do the sort of the net effect of the gains from a regrowth of the stable canopy and the existing gaps, and then remove the new gaps, we basically see a big increase in volume within these plots that have been sort of subjected to liana cutting. Again, this is about 3 times as much as where we see the tree planting, which is a little bit more than in the controls. And then if we contrast it back to the old growth system, you actually see that the old growth system is almost neutral. So it's actually losing about as much canopy volume over this period as it's gaining back in growth. So you can really now start to drill into the processes that are driving what we saw in the first few figures. One last bit of sort of that I wanted to add to this, just because I like to add layers of complexity to this. I think as an experiment, we could have stopped there, but one of the things I really like about the Saba biodiversity experiment is that it's an ecological experiment. It's not set out in the field, it's set out in the real world. And so underlying all of these treatments, which are randomly distributed across the landscape, we actually have topographic variation within the landscape. And so one of the things we were interested in is to understand, okay, once we know what the effects of the treatment is, do we still detect an effect of the environmental gradients that are present sort of in the underlying canopy? And the take-home message really is that we do, and we do see that really quite strongly. So on the y-axis here, we have the rate of canopy height change. This is again aggregated across the entire canopy. And then on the x-axis, we have a measure of the height above nearest drainage, which is basically a measure of how in this landscape, how close you are to the river. So the higher up you are, the more you are on a ridge, and the lower you are, more you are in a valley near the river. And basically the take-home message here is that the rate of recovery is actually strongly constrained by the local topography. So much so that this effect of local topography, which is about a difference of about 14 centimeters per year every 100 meters that you go up, is actually similar in magnitude to any of the interventions that we see. It's actually similar in magnitude to the liana cutting as an effect. Okay, so quick summary of the take-homes for the first sort of set of results that I showed you. First one is actually that there's tree planting interventions that happened at Saba biodiversity experiment have had some effect on the regeneration, but they're relatively modest, especially when we think of how big an intervention this is and how costly it is to do on the ground. The second one is that the liana cutting, and this fits with the rest of the literature that we know on this topic, really has a big effect in these sort of log forests in terms of the canopy recovery. But one thing that I would caution here, and this is why I was talking about the fact that I don't like to call these structural parasites right at the beginning, is that there is a lot of biodiversity and a lot of species that require need these lianas for their habitat and sort of either for their food or for moving around or whatever that might be. So actually, I'm a little bit cautious about promoting too much this idea of liana cutting when we think that, yes, it might have some big impacts on sort of canopy recovery from a carbon perspective, but we don't really understand as well what the implications might be for biodiversity. And finally, and this for me is being an ecologist, a really important message is that we can't treat these systems in isolations. We need to think about their context and where we are within the landscape. And actually, things like topography can really make a big difference in terms of determining the recovery trajectory of these systems. And if we were to want to assess the restoration success of any one particular patch of forest, if we don't know something about how topography or whatever else it might be influences these recovery trajectories, we might sort of get the wrong end of the stick when interpreting our data. So this is a plea to really think about the context in which your data is collected. Okay, so second part, we're going to change completely, not just part of the world, but also sort of ecological scale and temporal scale. We're going to slow right down to a system that's very different and much less dynamic, but to me, just as interesting and fascinating, which is the Great Western Woodlands of Western Australia. So if we were in a room and we were all in person, I would ask every one of you to put your hand up if you knew anything about the Great Western Woodlands, and my bet is that the vast majority of you would not. I did not before moving to Perth in Western Australia and having the good fortune of learning a lot about this from Suzanne Prober. And so the work that I'm showing you here is really a project that she initiated and that I'm just been very fortunate to be involved in. And I'm going to show you some work that Robin in our group has been doing, building on what we've done. But the Great Western Woodlands of Western Australia are, to my great surprise a few years ago, the world's largest temperate woodland ecosystem. They're roughly the size of England and Wales combined, and this yellow patch in Western Australia is where they lie. This is what they look like. So they're these open systems dominated by what we call obligate cedar eucalypt species, such as this salmon gum that you can see here. These salmon gum are probably 300 to 400 years old in this particular photo, and they're really an ecosystem that's shaped by fire and time. It's a slow-growing system, and one of the peculiar adaptations that it has compared to other systems in Australia is that it's the trees that dominate it are not particularly resilient to fire. When a fire goes through the system, it is almost always stand replacing, which actually gives it some interesting properties from an ecological perspective in terms of understanding the dynamics. So I said that this is a system that's really dominated by fire. I wanted to give you a picture of what that actually looks like. This is some work we've recently published looking at sort of the fire dynamics across the region. And the headline message is that close to 40% of the entire woodland habitat has burnt at some point in the last 50 years. So fire is a really big component of this ecosystem. In fact, these figures are really quite worrying because the reality is that these are probably much higher than historical baselines. So we don't exactly know where the system is headed in the future because it is such a slow growing system. But this is to give you a sort of an order of magnitude of what's going on. And really the first thing that we wanted to do here when we started this project was to try to track the recovery of these systems from when they burn to when they slowly transition through various stages to becoming old growth systems, these open old growth systems like I showed you in the picture before. And to do this, we basically collected a series of different sort of field plots where we roughly know the age of the stand since the last fire went through a combination of different methods. And we wanted to build some models that would allow us to map this out at the entire woodland scale. So this again gives you, here I'm just giving you an overview again from the top of just how structurally different these different age structures are. But the approach that we used to do this particular piece of work involved acquiring a combination of sort of LiDAR from drones, some LiDAR from planes at a slightly bigger scale, and then combining this with JEDI, which is NASA's sort of spaceborne LiDAR system. And so through this system, we were able to build the first sort of quantitative map that sort of shows where within this region we still have areas of intact old growth woodland. And one of the slightly reassuring signs when we did this is that despite those really widespread fires that have happened in the last 50 years, there is still a considerable amount of old growth woodland habitat left in this region. And this data sort of hopefully can help guide the conservation and management of some of these woodlands. But what I really wanted to sort of diverge and jump off on today was something that caught my eye when we were doing this modeling. So this is sort of underlying that map, basically, is this data that you see here. So on the y-axis of both plots, you have some data that we required from LiDAR, and each point is a plot in the field. And then this is the structural metrics, either height or canopy cover, are put in relation to the time since fire. So how long ago that particular patch of woodland burnt last. And you can clearly see some initial really fast, well, relatively fast, 100-year-old sort of scale recovery trajectories in these systems. that are behaving a certain way. But to me, what's really interesting is actually there seems to be a lot going on even later on. Once these systems have sort of reached a point where the canopy height is sort of stabilized, we're still seeing a lot of structural change going on. And I really wanted to understand what was going more on here. And so we took advantage of one location in particular within this wider landscape where we happen to have repeat acquisition LiDAR data, sort of spanning about 10 years. And what we really wanted to do was, again, take advantage of the open nature of this system to try and work not at a canopy scale, but at an individual tree scale. So what we did is we took the airborne LiDAR and we used some sort of freely available algorithms to detect the crowns of the trees. And then we did this both in the first time step in 2012, and then again in 2021, with the idea of tracking the recovery and dynamics of the individual trees. So this gives you a little bit more of a sense of exactly what I'm talking about. So on the sort of the little pictorial diagram, we have a couple of examples of the things that we're interested in tracking. So the sort of the four main ones that we tracked were, one, the growth of trees, so trees that were sort of found there at both time steps. We were interested in capturing canopy dieback for these trees, so thinking about trees that are still alive in the second time interval, but may have sort of shrunk in size. And then finally, looking also at mortality and ideally recruitment. I'm not going to show the recruitment data today because it's sort of slightly still work in progress, and also from a time perspective. And then just a few sort of overview metrics of what we've done and how well it's worked. So again, we have this site, which is about 25 kilometers squared. We're working across it, and we have about 50,000 matched trees with a reasonably good accuracy of the segmentation. And we're tracking, from a growth perspective, two things. One is canopy height growth, so tree height growth, and the other one is actually crown expansion and crown size change. And then we have this sort of like combine this sort of class of trees that have either shown dieback or mortality. So by our definition, this is trees that have either decreased by 30% in their height, or their crown area has shrunk by 30% between the two time periods. So just to give you an overview of what the results look like, the first take-home message is that both from a growth perspective, we see these really strong size-dependent growth trajectories. So this is height change in sort of the individual tree scale for different size bins. And in this case, we've classified tree size as crown volume, so a product of the crown area and the height. And you can basically see that the smaller size classes are gaining in height over time. But actually, when we get to the really, really big trees, of which there are not a huge amount, but of which there are enough in the landscape, we're actually seeing that on average, they tend to be sort of shrinking in size. They're sort of being affected by crown dieback within this bigger size class. When we look at the crown area change, actually, we get quite a different picture, where we see that actually the smallest trees are the ones that are growing slowest from a crown area perspective. And this instead seems to sort of increase over time as trees become bigger, and they're starting to allocate more to crown expansion. And you can actually see this really well if we combine the two data sets like this. So what we have here is the y-axis is tree height, on the x-axis we have crown area. And each arrow corresponds to one of those size classes. The beginning of the arrow is where those trees were in 2012. The end of the arrow is where they were in 2021. And you can basically see that they initially are investing primarily in this tree height growth, and then this tree height growth is sort of leveling off, but they're still expanding in their crown areas until we finally get to the biggest size classes, which are actually shrinking in terms of their height. So this is really giving us a size structure overview of the tree level dynamics. We can do the same thing for mortality. So these are the rates of mortality and crown dieback for different sort of size classes within this study system. And we can see basically that the smallest trees are the ones that are experiencing the highest rates of turnover. This sort of matches what you expect with the literature. And then this seems to decline quite sharply and level off I'd love to be able to argue that there's a U-shaped pattern in this curve, but I think that I'd be hard pressed to really buy that upturn right at the end. But that it does seem to be sort of increasing, so I like to mention that. And the other thing we can do, obviously, with this data is map them spatially. So we know where all the individual trees are, and so we can start to aggregate them in some way spatially, in this case at a 1 hectare scale, and look at how rates of, in this case, mortality and dieback vary across the landscape. And we see quite a lot of variation within different pixels of this wider landscape. There are areas that have suffered basically no mortality and dieback, and areas that instead are have suffered much more. And so really the final result that I want to show you is when we see this, we intuitively want to try to explain it. Why are we seeing these hotspots of mortality in a certain patch of the landscape and cold spots in others? Is there some part of this data that we can explain based on the spatial landscape that's there? And the interesting thing is that we can't explain a lot of the variation, but we can explain some of it, and in ways that I think are ecologically quite intuitive. So what we have here is a series of multiple linear regression models where we've essentially modeled height growth, crown area growth, and then mortality as a function of 4 things. One is the initial tree size of the tree. One is the canopy density of the surrounding area. So this is some measure of competition. We have a measure of terrain wetness index, which comes from the digital elevation model. So it tells us something about how water and nutrients flow through this landscape and accumulate through the landscape. And finally, we have a sort of a correction factor for the differences in the acquisitions between the 2 LiDAR data sets. So I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but this is purely for us to be able to be confident that the results that we're seeing are not due to an artifact of differences in the LiDAR. So I've discussed the tree size effects, so I'm not going to look at them. But what we're seeing here is that basically we have this really consistent effect of both canopy density and terrain wetness index on the growth and mortality of trees. So we're seeing that in areas of denser canopy, trees are growing faster vertically, but less so in terms of crown area expansion. And also that in areas with higher canopy density, trees are more likely to have died between the 2 different time periods. And conversely, when we look at the terrain wetness index, again, we see that it has an overall positive effect on growth. So we have faster rates of growth, both in terms of vertical and crown expansion in areas that are sort of wetter, if you will. And conversely, from a mortality perspective, we have areas that are drier within the, so mortality sort of be more likely to be in areas that are that have less access to these water and presumably also soil nutrients. So this to me is very exciting because basically we've not only been able to drill down to the individual tree level and get a sort of an overall population level picture, but we've been able to go one step further and really start to understand how it then plays out at a landscape scale and try to get a better sense of what those initial trajectories that I was showing you over multiple centuries, how they actually originate from much smaller timescales in the sort of decadal framework that we have here. Okay, so just a couple of take-home messages, and then I'm done and we can have some time for discussion. I think there's a huge potential for repeat LiDAR to allow us to track the fate of large numbers of individual trees, particularly in landscapes such as this one, which are open, where the individual trees are easy to segment, and we can do this with relatively high accuracy. And I think there's a lot we can learn from doing more of that. This kind of approach allows us to then start to disentangle some interesting things that are really hard to do from the field, and specifically in terms of how trees allocate resources to either growing vertically or expanding their crowns at different phases of their development. And also do something that we all know is really, really challenging in the field, which is to map mortality. So we're able to do that over much larger scales, and again, in a way that's sort of relatively comprehensive and goes back to that individual tree kind of approach. And finally, this is sort of a similar plea to the one that I had in my previous take-home message. I think that there's a lot of really interesting nuance that we can learn by then mapping these processes onto landscapes and trying to understand what drives their spatial patterning. And again, we're seeing here that topography is coming out as important. That's one of my, I'm endlessly fascinated by how topography shapes the structure and dynamics of ecosystems. So I really like when we can tell these kind of stories. And yeah, I think this is a really important kind of thing that we can do with these data that, again, would be hard to do if we only had data from field plots. Okay, so I've basically come to the end of what I wanted to say. I hope I've been able to make a relatively coherent case for how airborne LiDAR can really sit in the middle of these two opposite spectrums of sort of tools that we have at our disposal for studying forests, particularly in the context of global change. And yeah, all I wanted to do at the end is just thank a bunch of really excellent collaborators and colleagues that have helped me put together all that I've shown you today, and you for listening.
Great. Thank you, Tommaso, for a really fascinating and engaging talk. That was really, really fun. And so we have a bit of time for discussion now. And as I wrote in the chat earlier, you can either write your questions in the chat and we will read them out, or you can put up your hand and we may call on you. There's quite a few questions, so we might not be able to get to everybody. But if you have one, please either write them in or raise your hand. Tommaso, I'll start with one from Simon Besnard, and it also links, I think, to another question by Y. Theo. They ask, or Simone asks, would you expect to have similar effects of liana cutting if you're looking at net CO2 fluxes and not only height? Questioning whether this limitation on tree growth is also a limitation on the carbon sink.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we've somewhat purposely stayed away from trying to convert all of this volume change to carbon stocks, because there's a lot of nuance that goes into that, even from technologies like LiDAR, which are particularly good relative to, say, satellites to mapping biomass stocks. I think that we can do a relatively good job of getting snapshots of sort of biomass maps from LiDAR when we look at plots that vary hugely in their forest structure. But then when we apply those same equations and try to convert these changes in volume and basically height to biomass over time, my intuitive guess is that we can easily get into trouble, because you might have an open part of the canopy that's open, for instance, that we've lost, which may not have contained very much biomass, but your allometric model that underpins it doesn't know that and will think that something very big has been lost, basically, or vice versa, potentially. And so I think the few examples that we have where people have tried to do basically repeat LiDAR and estimate changes in biomass and then compare this to changes in biomass from plot data, I've yet to see something very convincing doing that well. So this is my way of getting around why we didn't put this into units of carbon. Whether they would change, I think yes. I think what basically sort of linking to that, a lot of what we're seeing is structural changes that might not be necessarily that important from a carbon perspective. It might be mainly small branches and sort of greater allocation to leaves, and it might not actually be very big new stems that have created over that short time period. I still think that the effects are so big in this system. We were talking about a threefold change that they're going to translate some way to changes in carbon as well.
Do you see a way forward to resolving those challenges that you raised? Is bringing in some modeling or something?
Yeah, I think the modeling, I think there's real potential to basically link up some of this structural data that we get from LiDAR with some actual process-based models that simulate what the canopy might look like if you did different things to it, like remove part of a crown or remove a few trees, and what the implications would be on the kind of metrics that we then extract from the LiDAR to estimate biomass. So I think there are ways that we could cleverly combine those approaches to get a better feel, at least, of the magnitude of the errors that we're likely introducing when we do it.
Okay, cool. So we have another question here from Viola Heinrich, and they are asking, so it's quite a different angle here. At the beginning of the talk, you showed an example of the planet data at about 3 meters resolution. And do you see these types of high resolution satellite data as competitors, for want of a better word, to airborne LiDAR data collection?
That's a great question. It's not so much competitors. I think at the moment, all of these products that are coming out from basically training some smart AI to recognize the structure of the canopy from these really high resolution imagery, all underpinned by LiDAR. So all of these efforts to create these global maps of canopy height or all sort of contingent on us having the LiDAR data to be able to train the models. I'm still very curious to see how these same models will apply temporally to a system. So say a disturbance were to come through and you would require new planet data at that same site, how well those would translate. And but having said that, I think that there is some extremely interesting work that's happening at the moment in terms of the individual tree segmentation of large canopy dominant trees from these sort of data sets, which is giving us really a picture that goes even beyond what we can get from LiDAR in terms of tracking individuals, at least big individuals across basically global scales.
Okay, so there's another question which I think is loosely related to that, but coming from the opposite direction. And this is from Tan Tuan Nguyen. And they're asking how you define the gap in a survey plot. So it's saying it's quite hard to define the area of a gap in the tropical forest. How could you define that? And I think they're getting at how can you relate that to the gap that you see in your LiDAR data?
Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, no one can agree on what a gap is, right? We can go back to the original definition, which is something that extends to 2 meters to the ground. But even then, we don't really have a spatial extent to match to that. So how big should a real gap be? I think my personal view of this is that LiDAR, from a gap perspective specifically, LiDAR is superior to any other thing that we have for mapping gaps. So that I would say that attempting to do that from the field when we have access to these kind of data sets is almost redundant. It's an incredibly hard job, and the data I don't think will ever be as accurate as what we can do from the LiDAR, where we can basically recreate this 3-dimensional model and then decide on multiple different definitions of what a gap is. We can play around with that. We can say, well, it has to be this big or this deep or this shape or whatever it is, but we have that freedom to understand how those decisions constrain our results. So I think I would say that trying to measure gaps in the field is too hard.
Okay. Another technical question related to gaps, and keeping on the same theme for a moment, comes from Helena Muller-Landau, and she's asking, so how sensitive are these analyses that you have of height and crown area to differences in LiDAR sensors, so the spatial resolution and the processing algorithms between the different data collections?
Yep. So hugely is the very quick answer, and we have put quite a lot of effort into getting around that to be as accurate as possible. I think a couple of pointers that I would make there is, firstly, working on the canopy height model as opposed to the point cloud data is very helpful in this perspective. The raw point cloud data from the LiDAR are much less comparable than the sort of canopy height models that we can derive from them. And we now have some processing pipelines that we've tested across very different data sets and sort of played around with them and changed some different properties of them to try to basically get to a pipeline that will give us a final canopy height model that's as comparable and stable as possible. So I think we're pretty close to having something that's really workable from that perspective. I think so that's one answer. I think the other thing in terms of the results that I showed here specifically, so for the first case study that I showed, we are talking about areas that were acquired by the same company with the same sensors and the same platform, a helicopter, everything is the same. So that's the best case scenario. That's as good as it gets. And for the second data set, again, both of them are high sort of pulse density data sets acquired sort of over a relatively big time period of difference. So we're sort of hedging our bets that this is as good as we can get it. But the truth is that it makes a big difference.
Okay, great. Let's move back to some of the implications or interpretation. So there's a question from Ruben Manzedo. And this is going towards the role of species diversity in these recovery patterns. And I was wondering a bit myself how the species that are recovering might affect the recovery rates and how that might change in these plots. And so they're asking, do you see ways forward to reliably identifying species with this sort of data?
From the LiDAR, no. personally. I think there's some efforts to try and do some of this in some systems where maybe the diversity is low and structurally very obvious. So like mixtures of broadleaves and conifers, where we might be able to make some headway just from the LiDAR. I think from a species mapping perspective, hyperspectral data is where that field is already, and that's where you would be trying to do this. I think one of the fundamental challenges is a lot of the recovery processes that we're seeing in these systems are driven by things that are in the understory of the canopy, which you will not see with any data set. You won't see them with the LiDAR, you won't see them with a hyperspectral sensor. You will only see them if you go to the ground and collect the field data. So we're never going to get around from having to do that. You're only really going to be able to understand something about the diversity of the canopy emergent trees. And those are probably will have been there for decades before any disturbance happened, and they're not really being affected as much by the interventions that we're looking at. What I will say from the first example that I showed you is that one of the things that the experiment did was plant different species mixtures within these different plots, with specifically the idea to address this question of whether different species accelerate the recovery compared to others. And from the LiDAR, at least, we see no evidence of that. But that doesn't mean that something in the understory isn't happening and might not be emergent in 10 or 20 years' time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. That makes a lot of sense. So kind of along those species lines, Franklin Alongi is asking if you can actually quantify anything about the volumetric loss of liana cutting from the LiDAR. Is that something you can pick out at all versus the trees?
That's a great question. I have been trying to I think that's a big caveat that I didn't mention, is that obviously, aside from removing the lianas, which are important structurally for the canopy, you're actually also removing biomass. And in some cases, the biomass of the lianas can be quite substantial and non-trivial. So the short answer is no, I don't have a good way of doing that. Partly because the data that we have from the LiDAR was collected 10 years after the first interventions in terms of the liana cutting. So we are missing that initial phase of change. But I think it would be very hard to do from the LiDAR alone. I think spotting the lianas from the LiDAR would be very challenging from the airborne data. It might be much easier from optical data or multispectral data, because they can be quite obvious in these kind of imagery.
Okay, and we have here another technical question from Yude Pan. How your LiDAR data processing deals with the complex topography?
Yeah, so that's another thing that we've been working on. I say we, the person who's really been working on this is Fabian Fischer, who is in this. There's a photo of him on the screen still. So he's basically one of the other projects that we have on the go at the moment is actually trying to compile as much LiDAR data as we possibly can from different places and bring it together and uniform it in such a way that we can analyze it as a big global data set. And the big challenge that we've had there is exactly the kind of thing that we were alluding to before with the questions of comparability, where we've had to basically come up with processing pipelines that allow us to derive products that at the end are comparable. So we have some rough rules of thumb. We need a minimum of 2 points per meter, 2 pulses per meter squared in order to derive a robust canopy height model. So we're limited to data sets that are better than that. And we definitely see effects in really rugged terrain where you can get these artifacts of the topography. So we have a couple of ways around them. Some of them are just masking out really highly topographic areas. And in other cases, we're actually adapting the algorithm that detects the ground to better fit the ground relative to what we get from the conventional off-the-shelf algorithm. So we're playing with that, but yes, that's another one of these classic examples where we can struggle really on the really topographically complex systems.
Sounds like there's plenty to keep you busy for a few years to come.
Not me.
Okay, I'm going to take chair's prerogative for one last question. I think we've got through most of the main points that were raised in the questions in the chat, and I just wanted to ask you about the topographic effects you saw in Malaysia, or in Borneo, I should say. And do you have any indication why you have this big difference in growth higher up versus lower down in relative to water courses. I guess I was kind of surprised because I think of this as a rainforest and I don't think of it as being water stressed. But is it water stressed? Is it heat? Is it something else?
I think, yeah, I think the sort of the examples I can draw from a site that's only maybe 50 to 100 kilometers away, where we've done quite a lot of work on these local topographic effects. And this is a system that's sort of protected area, undisturbed, where we see these huge, really stark differences in the structure and dynamics of forests across these really not particularly obvious topographic gradients. We're only talking about a few hundred meters in elevation, and yet the forest canopy can grow from being 80 meters tall to 30 meters tall, and the species composition is completely different. So I think there's several things at play there. I think there's a big one is soil nutrients and soil structure, and that's affecting which species dominate in those different patches of the landscape. We tend to get more sort of conservative species on these sort of more rugged, exposed sort of ridge tops. And they tend to be shorter and grow less fast and actually die less quickly as well, compared to the lowlands, where we get these emergent huge dipterocarps that are actually very fast growing, but also quite dynamic. So I think there's a combination of soil nutrients and also water retention and availability. So yes, it isn't a water stress system typically, but every few years a big sort of El Nino event will come through and sort of reinforce those differences in topography in terms of water availability. And that's then that matters. It becomes a bottleneck and it creates these patterns. That's the best explanation I can come up with.
That sounds a very convincing explanation to me. Thanks. That's really interesting. Okay, so I think we should wrap it up there, and I'd like to thank you, Tommaso, for coming along. Really fascinating talk and great discussion, and thank you for everybody who also came along to see the seminar and for asking questions. It's been a really good discussion. I think lots of interesting things to bring up. I would just highlight now that we will have another talk in the series by Joanne White from the Canadian Forest Service, and she'll be talking about forest dynamics and recovery from the perspective of Landsat remote sensing, and she'll be talking on the 21st of November, so just about in a month's time. And if anybody would like to give one of these talks or put somebody else forward, you think they got some really interesting results, would be good to share with the community, please do just drop us an email. You can get in contact with us via the website that's on the, as Cornelia showed earlier, on the background behind me, or you can just drop any of the team an email and we'll take it forward. So yeah, thank you very much and have a nice evening, everybody.